So when I first read a review of The Master and His Emissary, I think it was the one in The Guardian, I think it was Mary Midgley.
It was, probably.
And it was such a moving piece of writing. I mean, I would always in those days read all the book reviews anyway. But then I had to literally go out and run to Waterstones and get the book. And I came back with it and holed up for a whole weekend. And then evangelically running to Tai Chi class on the Tuesday night saying, "Your mum's arm." We have terminology for when the students don't even know that they've gone like this in your face, but they deny all knowledge of having lashed out at that moment. And we had finally Western terminology for things that we knew to be happening from decades of Tai Chi experience, but no way other than very obscure, wonderful Chinese terms or to point to them and to talk about these things with the students. And your book comes along, and despite it being, well, on top of it being a kind of a life-changing book read for me, it actually fed into a school of between 30 and 50 people on their day-to-day work. The thing that they were really, that it was an enrichment of their life to be doing the Tai Chi, and now we had a way to talk about it together in those moments when we're even doing it. Going, "Oh yeah, your mum's arm," or whatever. It's like, "Oh yeah, I completely denied the fact that that was real." And to go straight into an embodied practice from a book of words was a delight, because normally that only happens with the Tai Chi classics and the Taoist classics. So
I remember you teasing me about, not teasing me about it, but going, "It's my mum's arm," which perhaps I should just explain that. Yes, that patients sometimes after a right hemisphere stroke disown a paralysed limb, their left arm, and when asked what it is, they deny any ownership of it. And one of the patients that I quoted in the Master's episode, "It belongs to my mother."
And teaching Tai Chi and practicing Tai Chi, especially because ours is a martial art and we are pushing hands, which if people don't know, that is a partner work where you're very close and you're right in each other's face, quite literally. And you cannot get away from that relationship. And the pushes that come are not up to you. How you respond is not always, but usually very closely aligned to where you are at in your culture, in your life, in your body that day, in the moments in your of experience, the mood that you're in. All of them inflect what happens. So you could have, well, I could have 15 years training and still that day when I'm agitated, lash out. Then the person will go, "Oh," and you're completely denying that you've done it because it's very much unconscious. But through the joy of having a practice to work with is that you cannot then deny it. So the other person is there too saying, "You just did that thing." And after the sick feeling has arisen and abated, you can then work on it.
Yes.
And the richness that your terminology and writing down for a layperson such as myself, the research, meant that we could start to form some useful correlations, because when you push hands for 10 minutes, you've probably pushed a couple of hundred times. Right. So it's a very repeatable experiment. When someone's quality of touch changes under your hands over minutes, hours, weeks or years, it has changed, and it is measurably so. And then when you came to Tai Chi, that, what was it, 2014, I think you came to our summer workshop, and you felt the sticking hands that we did.
Yes.
How did that feel to you?
It was fascinating. I mean, I loved conceiving this in a completely new way for me, which was to think of it in terms of unconscious bodily movement. And the fact that you saw these bridges was remarkable. I hadn't anticipated that, of course. But I remember thinking, this is very interesting, and I must carry on with this. But then I live on an island where I don't know that there's a Tai Chi class going on, maybe, but unknown to me.
But there's a sense, so in the classics there is a line, the Tai Chi classic says, "At first you must follow the other, later you may do as you wish." But it translates better as, at first you must follow the other, later you can follow your heart's desire. And that's sin, heart, mind, not the bloody heart of like willfulness.
No.
At first when we're training this quality of attention, connection, allowing, which we call yielding, allowing the other person to be as they are, allowing the catastrophe of modernity to be as it is, allowing my annoying friend to be as they are, requires a massive change of heart in us. So that itself is decades work. But once you are in connection, you have to follow the other person. If you touch my hand and push me, and I resist you, we are at war immediately. Whatever I say about it, so if you do that again and I allow it and you push, we're not at war. It just takes one of us to decide it's a relationship, not a war.
Yes.
So that's probably the first thing I had to learn.
Yes.
There was following the other at first. There's like eating bitter. It's what's one of the other phrases we would say? Small loss, small gain. If I really only follow you a bit,
Yes.
I don't get much advantage. I don't learn much.
No.
But if I truly allow you to move me, whether that's with your writing or your movement or your push, all of you spills out.
Yes.
And you fall into an emptiness.
I think that seems intuitively right, because it's the idea of something flowing, which is, when you block it or break it, it's not going to work. So you need to be able to. What's brilliant, I think, in these arts that you practice is that you don't have to give up anything of you in this process. It enriches you and it enriches the other person. So it's something that is positive, but it sounds rather like it might be negative or pushing back against something.
The urge with things in the world is because they're mainly resistant materials. Doors, rocks, everything pushes back. Is that we feel that relationships should be that way, and that if you assert yourself in a certain way, then all will be well. But it's not necessarily true. And being a doormat or being a leaf in the wind is also no good.
Exactly.
So people often say,
that's
Taoism,
not what it's about at all.
Taoism is so misunderstood, and it's often, well, you just go with the flow. Oh, great, go with the flow, down to sea, crack your head on a rock, goodbye. It's not.
No.
It's more like the salmon swimming upstream.
Yes.
You have to spawn, you have to go upstream.
Yes.
But if you go right up the middle of the river, bashing against the current, you'll be exhausted and washed out to sea, and you won't have fulfilled your destiny.
Yes.
And the trick is to go up the eddies, up the side, to find, by listening with your whole body, the places where you can slip in.
Yes.
And these senses are difficult to hone.
Interestingly, that idea of the movement that isn't willed but achieves something is true of flow in a stream. There are examples of dead fish that actually go upstream against the current because their bodies are so aligned that they can use the turbulence in water, which there always is in moving water, to aid their passage. The reason that salmon can jump upwards, it's not that they're amazing athletes. It's funny that they use the upward movement that also accompanies the downward movement of the water. There is an upward movement that compensates, and they get into that. And so in a stream, there are always these movements where you could be going with the flow, but that doesn't mean you're going necessarily the same way the stream would take you. And you're allowing a part of the stream to take you another way. So it's not as simple as it sounds. Just as not doing is not the same as doing nothing. Doing nothing is simply a negation.
If only we could just drink tea and do nothing and everything remained done.
Yes.
So the eddies in a river are for me, the perfect example of so many things, both with Wu Wei, and with Tai Chi, but also in life. Because if you look at only the eddy and cut it off and get yourself a nice little oxbow lake or something, well, you've immediately got a dead pond, nothing actually happening. No. So first of all, the eddies must remain part of the living system of the stream. They're very difficult to look at because, of course, it's fractal.
Yes.
And at once it's always changing. But that's where the life is.
Yes.
To go wider, I think that why your book landed so well with the school and the wonderful people in my teacher school and in my school in those days was we were all attempting to not cut ourselves off from the stream. and allow the Tai Chi to influence our lives in a way that made things better, because, well, relationships, family, they're tricky. And when you've worked on something fastidiously for months with a partner pushing you in good faith and in goodwill, and always trying to make things a little bit harder, just enough so that you had a challenge, it's a really good place to practice being in the flow of things when you go back home at Christmas with the in-laws, or the same pushes will come, but they might be coming out of someone's mouth.
Yes, very good. And a degree of resistance is not the same as you can be just merely obstructive, but there is a kind of resistance which is actually facilitative. One of the themes of my work is that nothing happens, nothing is created without resistance. And that matter actually is the element in the cosmos that offers that degree of both permanence and resistance that wouldn't be there if there were no matter.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I like that.
For me, that sense of friction making movement possible is one of the matters of matter.
Yes.
And the non-resistance that we aspire to in my style, because Dr. Chi, our great grandmaster, was such a profound yielder, being such a slender and gentle man, it looks like no martial effect is happening. But what happens is you're constantly in connection. And no matter what comes towards you, you don't flee that connection. After a while, if you can remain in what we would call central earth, which in English you could say remain in your integrity, i.e. keep your uprightness.
Yes.
You move your feet to be in a better place. You don't doggedly hold on to the land you're standing on. You allow yourself to be moved.
Yes.
And what happens is nobody then is pushed over. You're just still there in connection, just millimetres out of reach of anything landing and hurting, but still present. And it isn't about dominating someone else or winning. It's about staying in connection.
So that what is happening is coming out of a twosome, out of a relationship. It's not coming from the will of a person.
Precisely.
Which is an unusual thought for a lot of Western people.
Yeah. Well, I think that John Kells, my grandmaster, put that as not two.
Yes.
For a while he was saying, well, it's not just one, and it's not just me and you. And while we're working, he was trying to find ways to describe this third heart, this thing that comes into to being between any two living entities.
Yes.
And by living, I also mean the mountains or
well, I was going to say, not even living necessarily in the conventional sense. Yes.
I realise I think of living as beyond what is just alive. But yes, I've outed myself as an animist, I realise. Yes,
I mean, in the matter of things, I argue that inanimacy is the limit case of animacy, not animacy a special case of inanimacy.
Absolutely.
Which is a point first made by the biological philosopher Robert Rosen. But anyway, yes, that what you're describing is probably what I call betweenness, which is misunderstood by some people as it were being something that exists in a space between two things or two people, but is what happens when two people are in a relationship and they're taken up into something which has both of them and the space between and something new that arises out of it. So it's a dialectical process, really.
John would call that the third heart, and I think
that's reasonable.
Do you know Newgrange, the wonderful ancient Irish site?
Oh yes, yes.
So you know the spiral petroglyphs that are there.
Yes.
There's many that are 3 spirals, and he always because he was Irish, he always adopted that. Oh, and his name was Kells. He adopted that as his pseudo illustration of what the third heart is like. There's the living vortex of your own person, but the minute we're in connection, which is always happening before we think it is, the third heart or the betweenness or the thing between is born. And it has the qualities of us, but it also has the qualities of the attention that we bring to it, so it can, for instance, wither or fade or break.
Yes. So the disposition of each person is vital to this process. But what happens when you're training somebody who hasn't, as it were, yet achieved a sense of how this relationship works? how do you help them to feel it? Because in a way that would be an analogy for the situation we find ourselves in more widely in society now, that we need to help people see how it's not the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere, but the two of them working in harmony, which means the left in service to the right. So we need to help people understand how that works and how to achieve that. And maybe there's an analogy in trying to take a novice who is presumably mindset is not yet accepting or understanding what it is you're trying to impart. How do you do that?
Luckily, Chuang-Tzu had the answer. He writes about it so well, for instance, in The Cook and His Cleaver, that you have to have you need to, what we would call, I suppose, using the false to cultivate the real, you need a false thing. So it's a thing to hang it on.
Yes.
So when people come and pay my teacher or myself for Tai Chi,
yes,
they will learn during that term, the short form or whatever.
Yes.
They go away and their folding money was spent on a thing that they can point at.
Yes, yes.
Meanwhile, for free, underneath, because you mustn't charge for these things.
Yeah.
The other understanding that we're talking about, the ineffable thing, either does or does not transmit.
Yes.
So that's about transmission, and that can happen immediately, gradually, or not at all.
Yeah. Yes.
But because that's not what we overtly offer,
yes,
and I guess you blow it all by talking about it on the internet, but it's part of my teaching in anything, whether it's the art materials or whatever it is I'm teaching. Yes. A heart of a great matter can't be told.
Exactly.
Well, apart from by you in your books. But then you pay a price for this in the energy that it takes to manifest it into a form. We have a traditional and old sleight of hand, which is in all the Taos, whether in China or Japan that I know of, and in Korea, where you have another art, which ostensibly you're studying. So it could be your ikebana or your sword, your calligraphy, your Zen garden. And you absolutely apply yourself to it.
Yes.
Meanwhile, if you have a good teacher and you're lucky, the underneath teaching of the working with things, the way of things, the wu way of things, manifests.
Yes.
And you can't be told it. No. Then one day your teacher can point. Because for ages you're just going, I don't know what I'm doing. And your teacher goes, yes, that. What? I didn't do anything. And after 5 years of pointing at you going, but I didn't do anything, which is when the right hemisphere is in control of what you're doing and you don't know what you're doing.
Yes.
You get a sense, finally, of the nothing that is, of this thing they point to, this kind of incredible lacuna, where you also are, but it's not the you that you thought you
thought
knew.
It was, yes. This reminds me slightly, I don't know whether appropriately, of T.S. Eliot's remark that the meaning of a poem is the meat that the burglar tosses to the dog while he burgles the house. In other words, you focus the person on specifically something, and that enables something else to go on out of sight, but it's the out of sightness that matters.
This is so difficult to talk about the thing that we want to remain out of sight, but that we want people to partake in.
And we talked about this earlier, but I was saying that my message is that the implicit matters so much, and yet what I'm doing in my work is trying to explain in a more explicit way what it is and why that is important, and that I'm somehow undoing the very thing I believe in.
No, but you're not, because it returns.
It returns to the hidden realm. It's that right to left and back to right.
Yes.
There's a role for that explicitness, but it has to be taken up by the reader and taken back into their life and absorbed, which is why when they say, so what do I do? It's so very difficult, because I could spin the story about what they might do. And maybe by concentrating on that, the other stuff would happen.
Well, that would be the self-help book version of all the things
I don't
you write,
want to write.
which you don't want to write, and which other people will be doing, trying to put your things into practice in. Well, try this thing, and that's fine. And
this is fine.
That's part of
I know some therapists do, which is great.
Yeah, and that's how things...
They take things up and run with them, that's fine.
Absolutely, but the thing that we're pointing at is also like the body decomposing after death. It's the bit that loads of people don't want to talk about. People Charlotte Ducan certainly talks about it, and then Sophie Strand does about, I want to be good compost. And there is an aspect where you have to hold the recombination of things will mean the end of you. But of course it doesn't mean the end, like the world that comes after modernity isn't the end of the world.
Yes.
This organism will make very good compost. I've been eating very nice food recently. And apart from a few little lumps of metal, which are not too harmful, should degrade nicely into very good food for trees. And I think some of my Christian friends find that distressing, that there's no salvation for that. But the recombining of all the parts for me is joyful. The returning of either knowledge back to the darkness where it has to become unconscious, or me back into the darkness of the soil, holds no... Fear is the wrong word. It's not like I'm looking forward to it tomorrow. I'd quite like to hang around a bit longer and have some more conversations, but the darkness isn't the place that's the problem.
No,
the problem is mainly in the glaring light.
Absolutely. Yes, I mean, that's an important insight, that actually we often see less when there is a glare of a light. I can't remember who I was talking to the other day, who was saying, if there was a 3 million watt light bulb in the room, you wouldn't be able to see anything. If there was no light in the room, you wouldn't be able to see anything. But if there's a small light in the room, you start to see everything. And Erwin Chargaff has this image of a flashlight, that if you turn it on the world, you see the lumber room that is around you, but you don't see anything beyond. Whereas if you switch it off, then you see the stars infinitely large and extensive beyond. So darkness has its place as well as light. And I suppose that my view on the decomposition, not just of the body, I suppose, but also of the of my mind, is that it's not lost, because it's like the whirlpool in the stream. The whirlpool is not an alien thing in that stream. It is the stream for that moment at that point.
Yes, it is streaming.
Yes, and you and I are streaming whatever is in the whirlpool that is us now. But when we go, whatever that was there is not lost. It will move on. And my view is that, perhaps unlike the water, but some people would say not unlike the water, actually, it contains traces of the experience it has had. And so whatever it is that is us is not lost.
No.
Although I don't want personally to be trapped as me forever. That would be for me a great loss. And I'd quite like to be liberated to something beyond and bigger.
The return requires a massive shift of context. So just as in every yield that I've had to make to a push I didn't want to receive, whether that was in life or some big bloke pushing me in Hamburg at a push hands conference, every time I expand my context bigger than the hurt at that moment, I'm immediately liberated. My energy is returned to a greater flow of energy. My mind relaxes because it hasn't tightened around not the good sense of the present moment, but the apparent apparent present moment, which is problematic. And as soon as I relax that, which is the relaxation response, which is well known as a way to get over a phobia or something, as well as my body relaxing, my energy relaxes and my mind relaxes and moves towards freedom that were not possible the split second before, are suddenly now possible because I have massively increased the context. Suddenly a tiny movement in myself, whatever that is, changes the relationship, and a punch that was going to land and hurt suddenly massively falls past me, and the person stumbles into emptiness, looking annoyed, and a joke happens, and the moment moves on. But when I contract around the moment, whether that's the moment of my whole life or the moment of an unkind word on the street, nothing seems possible, and no moves can be made.
Which is why letting go is an increase, not a decrease. It's so important, and again, from a point of view of the hemispheric balance, what you say about context is, as you know very well, it's the right hemisphere that is attentive to context. The left hemisphere tends to see everything in its decontextualized form, which is one of the reasons it doesn't understand anything, because what it is only comes from its context. But that process of focusing on some hurt or some perceived slight or something like that, and not only uses up a lot of unnecessary energy and makes you unhappy, not the other person, but it also causes the left hemisphere to focus down more tightly. Because when you're anxious about something, whatever it may be, when you're stressed or anxious, your body can go into a spasm, but your mind can go into a spasm. And what happens is that the left hemisphere focuses down on something using concentric, tightly organized networks to sort of home in on this target. But often the answer is going to be outside of that and needs more context. So it's only later when you can relax that spasm of attention that the right hemisphere can come in and see the poetry, see the joke, see the meaning. So that's a very real phenomenon. And of course, it's the explanation of the tip of the tongue phenomenon. When you can't remember something, and the harder you try, the less you remember it. But a minute later, when you're doing something else, you go, oh, of course, yeah.
There are about 10,000 analogies and experiences from Tai Chi that are just exactly what you said. That I could draw on, but I was thinking of two in particular. One is the instruction. So when I was reading your book many years ago, I think the first or second time I read it, about the relaxed open gaze and the peripheral vision available to the creatures when they're in the expanded awareness of all things mode, if you like, the right hemisphere mode. Now there is a gaze that we are practicing in general everyday Tai Chi and meditation, and the tip of the tongue is just against the top palate and you're relaxing your eyes. And if you look at one thing, if I focus on this fleck on your jumper, the whole world has come in and I don't have awareness of the peripheral vision, and a certain kind of feeling sense takes over the body. At first, because I'm not particularly anxious just now, a kind of subtle anxiety tightening with this very, very centre of the eye gaze, which notices detail, like when the bird is picking out the seeds, which is a different awareness to when the bird is sensing the whole garden. When we are in the middle of a fight, in what I practice, if I focus down on the fleck on my opponent's jumper, I cannot respond. My body is tight, my mind is tight, my energy, my awareness are tight, and nothing is available to me to flow. And I remember watching a great friend, Master Sam Massich, teaching one of his students, and he was demoing, and he kept saying to his student, stop looking at one spot, because he needed him to free up his body. And even though we can go from the awareness side of things, our tradition is working from the body, but it massively affects the awareness. So when we say to a student, relax the gaze, more awareness of the peripheral vision, look out roughly towards the horizon, but don't look at anything, just allow a kind of evenness of gaze. Their shoulders drop, their bellies round out, their breathing softens, and suddenly when you go towards them with a punch, they've already outreached, connected, yielded, and dealt with everything without even knowing it. Because they were in their right mind.
That's very interesting. It reminds me of something I learned from the physician who looks after the motorcycle races and the TT races in the Isle of Man. And there were a number of observations that were fascinating. This is, for those who don't know about the TT races, probably the most dangerous sporting event in the world. It takes place on a 62-mile road, which is just an ordinary road for most of the year, and it has drain covers and potholes and steep bends and so on. It's not a racetrack, but it's quite common for riders to approach or even reach speeds of 200 miles an hour. So this is absolutely colossal. And there's a grandstand at a certain point on a rise, and this physician said to one of the riders, as you go past the grandstand, you must be positioned so precisely that when you get to the bottom of a steep hill, you can take the 90 degrees bend in the right place. If you got it slightly wrong, you be dead. And then you've got to get yourself over Quarter Bridge, which is some mile along. And the rider said, when I'm going past the grandstand, I'm not thinking about that descent or the bend. I'm already at Quarter Bridge, which is really interesting. So their attention was somewhere else. And it goes with, there are many observations he made, and I have a lot more to say about this in the Matter with Things, but one of his observations was that their senses are extraordinarily alert, so that one of them, for example, describes passing very fast, but being able to smell inside his helmet somebody smoking a cigarette in a field. So he was aware of everything, but their eyes appear to be not focused on anything. If you look at them, they appear to be staring somewhere else.
Yep.
So again, it's this thing of being enormously alert and in the moment, but precisely because of being in the moment, not focused in that narrow way, but somehow allowing it all to come. And when another observation he had was that one racer who produced an absolutely record time had decided that he had a problem and he had to pull off and sort it and get back on the road. And he thought, well, that does it. I'm never going to do anything on this circuit. So he just, as he thought, took it very easily, and when he got back, he'd actually broken his record and most of everybody else's. It is very interesting.
This is that relaxation, which is not the
Yes.
flaccid relaxation of like the
Absolutely
Westerner in front of the
not.
telly,
No.
and it's not the. We have pastiches of it in sort of the warrior pose, but
Yes.
there is a way to relax where everything is still in utmost readiness.
Yes.
And there's no accelerator and brake being pushed at the same time. There's no burning up of one's energy. There is a, and it doesn't always manifest the same because it's different before you sing on stage as it is before you write a book. But there's still none of them enhanced by being tense or anxious. And a lot of the training of flow, of Csikszentmihalyi Mihaly's flow I do, is this relaxation under more and more pressure. So that you can maintain that flow state even whilst going at 200 miles an hour on a massive racing bike.
Yes, yes.
But it's the same in the heat of a fight, and the same in, I think, in love as it is in war.
Yes.
It's the presence that makes it all possible.
Absolutely.
They say in the Tai Chi classics that first you train movement consciously, but later that you're using unconscious movement.
Yes.
And by that they don't mean unconscious, like the drunkard. Although they have relaxation, they just don't have integrity. They softly fall down the stairs.
Yes,
But I would like to be that soft, but without having to drink the whiskey because the headache afterwards.
But you could just drink less whiskey.
I could just drink less whiskey. That's different.
But that's very good. Yeah.
But that relaxation shouldn't really be called relaxation, and we don't have the words for this correct tone, which is why we always talk about tuning the lute string just so, or to get just the right tone. It's not too loose and not too tight.
Yes.
And I think that's
it. And I think these motorcyclists describe something which is not the sort of exhilaration that you might imagine out of, driving so fast, but they're actually suspended somehow as this is going on. But in a peaceful, conscious way, 200 miles an hour, and they actually have to take bends on which there are stone walls, and if their leathers don't brush the wall, they won't actually make the turn. So it's all micro, not managed, but absolutely not managed.
Absolutely
it's micro unmanaged. It's got to be sensed, understood, taken up into what one's doing, but not thought about.
The left hemisphere cannot do that in time. Even if it could do it, you can't make a flow chart of that because that's not how it's working. Decisions are not being made. That's why when the student says, I didn't do it, we go, yes, that was the right touch. That was so soft, I almost fell in. And they go, I wasn't doing anything. What people think they are is often that list making, that's the mind that they are associated with. And what I think your work, and bizarrely what my work is asking people to do, is to loosen the grip of association on that one thing, which I wouldn't call necessarily a personality, but a way in which that tight managerial mind on the living body and the living soul.
Essential that one's got to allow that, but not just, I think, wonderful as Tai Chi is as an exercise in doing this, but it needs to be carried over into the way we lead our lives.
It has to. And that, which is great to have the dinging clock, that's what your book did to our schools and to the wider community that it went out into, because obviously there was wonderful people in the schools like Marcel Theroux and Dr. Michael Parsons passing on the book. It started to go from hand to hand into many kind of wider philosophical communities and other Taoists, and for us it was a pathway. Tai Chi changed a lot of our ordinary lives too. I'd say at least half the people who stay in it find it transforms relationships and so on.
I'm sure.
But then you provided us with the philosophical wording and framework to be able to talk about it with people outside our family of moving people, because not everybody has stood for 15 years in a room being pushed. So it was helpful, thank you, to be able to say, these things exist elsewhere, and if you profoundly change your way of being, it can have massive beneficial effects, and they ripple outward.
It's the way of being, the way of attending, that seems to be the trick. And it just occurred to me, which I'd never thought before, that perhaps the explanations, the accounts that I give in my work are also, in essence, the meat that is tossed to the dog, and that people actually take away not just that, but that knowledge that they now understand or have words for something that they probably already intuitively knew, allows them to, frees them to access it, not just through sort of application of things that they read, but it sort of is already releasing something, because you said half of the people who do the Tai Chi tell you that it's improved their lives, at least half. And in a way I could say that I receive so many messages from people who say, you know, your book has changed my life, but more specifically, it's changed my relationships, it's changed my marriage, it's changed my work. You know, and it's not presumably because they took away something and practiced it. It's because that having seen something which is accessible to their mind now, because it's explained in a way that circumvents the gatekeeper of the left hemisphere and says no, but this actually goes deep and shows how the right hemisphere is really the one that's doing the hard work here. That they can then joyfully enter into that kind of a life and that kind of a disposition.
Absolutely.
That they were alienated from by indoctrination in this culture that we have, which is this. But what I mean specifically by that is the reductionist, materialist vision of the world, which I think is leading us to destruction in so many ways. It's helping us famously to destroy the planet. I think it's now helping us to destroy society.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I'm very glad that you didn't call your book McGilchrist Says You're Doing It Wrong, Do This. And because you didn't have a didactic title or method, you slipped things under people's radars. So it's like cooked in the transit.
Yes.
You're just cutting up an ox,
Yes.
not blunting your blade. And, you know, and someone who notices that, the king comes across and says, oh, this is the refinement of skill, this is the epitome of skill. And you kind of go, you go and do your talks like this, and you say, yes, and this is this. And meanwhile, pointing to all the things that it isn't, that's not what you're doing. Yeah. So I would venture to say that you've done the non-doing of showing people what non-doing is.
Yes. Well, of course, according to my own philosophy, there ought to be a union of doing and non-doing, which is, we don't want just non-doing if that means not doing anything. Yeah. We don't want just doing if that's the usual drive to achieve something linearly. But we need this further synthesis of doing. We need both of them.
So you cannot have wu-wei, you cannot have non-doing without doing, and it has to start with doing.
That's interesting.
There's a very interesting chap in Canada who is translating lots of classics. I don't read the Chinese, so reading the Taoist classics in these sensitive translations at the moment is very interesting. And first you need, it's a bit like that phrase they ask for for a Taoist master who would go into the hills to avoid the trouble, but first to have a foothold in the world. So there's a great writer I love, Liu Yiming, from about 1600s, who had nothing but scorn for the man who would leave his family and go and do his Taoism in the hills.
Yeah.
There are things that must be attended to. So to clothe yourself, to feed yourself, to have a safe place to lay your head, to take account of and take care of what you are responsible for. And a lot of the writing that I love is also applicable to statecraft, which couldn't be further from my life than anything.
No.
But the context of it is the same. There are things we must do, and they should be done. It's interesting to use the word should, but they should be done. But there is then...
But it is good that they should be done.
It is good that they should be done, or nothing, and then there is just chaos, because things have been left undone. And then you have to rush to get things made back up to okay.
Yes.
There is a timeliness to non-doing. In fact, non-doing is often doing. Another good description of it would be uncontrived action, which I really like, which is Mark's, my teacher's one. And I like also doing just enough.
Yes.
And then timely action and no more than is needed. And that begins to have that kind of, what's the Swedish for that? The lagom, the just enough.
Yes. Such an important point, because that's a missing from our culture, is that there is always such a thing as that's enough. Of anything you consider good or whatever, that you start to go into the downward part of the curve if you keep pushing. And that's in the I Ching. It says the man who keeps pushing onwards without realizing what he's doing goes beyond the point where things are good and starts to lose whatever it is. So I think that's important. And I was thinking of a phrase I sometimes use, not perhaps very felicitous, but I talk about active passivity, because otherwise people misunderstand passivity. It sounds bad and it's a negation, but as always I say there's nothing negative about inhibition and negation. Often they are actually creative processes. And
also how the mind works. It's just saying no or not saying no, which is exactly the same as Tai Chi. You either allow or you allow the other person. We can't block. I'm a small woman. I will be pushed over. So you say no, or you don't say no.
Yes. That's great, and that's also part of my philosophy. So there are a lot of resonances there.
It's
wonderful.
It is amusing that from such different life ways, yours and mine, that we would come to an accord about the matter of things, the small matter of how the universe is. But it feels like a generative conversation that's been going on. I don't know. Yeah, since I wrote Your Book Changed My Life letter. What was that, like 12 years ago? Something like that.
Probably, yes.
Possibly more.
Yes.
But it hasn't stopped doing that. And now that I have this time finally to look into the Taoist alchemical terms and refer them back to the terminology that you've had and the things that you're pointing to in your earlier book, I'm really looking forward to talking about that with you when I have actually written it all down, about true lead and true mercury, about the essence of conscious thought, that way of using the bright mind that is, if you like, the left hemisphere of the kind of the possibility of organising everything, but yet not filling it. It's like having a wonderful library and the computer set up and all the books in the right place, but yet the moment before you start where all the thoughts are still just there, ready to crystallise. That's the feeling of that. And then also the real sense of true knowledge, which is true lead, which is in the body and is maybe perhaps more of a right hemisphere way of engaging with all things, has no words with it, but is fully connected. Obviously we cannot work without both.
What I like particularly is that you're talking about something that is very skillful, that you've been practicing for decades, and that has to be painfully, or not painfully, but slowly acquired by anyone who wishes to practice it. And it's something very subtle, and it can be expressed in terms that make it sound easy, like you just move and you just flow. And one of the things I really want to get, there are so many misconceptions about hemisphere differences, but one is that the right hemisphere is this sort of let it all hang out hemisphere, and it absolutely isn't. it's in fact not only emotionally far more intelligent than the left hemisphere, but perhaps for that very reason, it is also the center of necessary emotional restraint and a degree of emotional inhibition where required, where appropriate. And so it exercises a kind of wise restraint a great deal of the time, which is where all these words come into the picture. But this is not a simple matter, and it is not a matter of laxity. And sometimes when I talk to people about education, one of the things I have to sort of get across to people is that I'm not an advocate of education becoming sloppy and just allowing children to do whatever they want and comes into their heads. That's a complete dereliction of our duty to help them learn to shape them into all these skills that they won't just get by doing nothing. They get by doing something to begin with, which is entering into the relationship with the teacher. And I think that the idea of teaching as a relationship is another thing that's very, very important. It's very obvious in what you've just described. But too often people think of teaching as a whole, in, for example, a classroom, as being a one-way process. And what I'm not saying is some trendy thing that the children can teach the teacher more than the teacher can teach the child. I don't believe that. I think there are things that teachers do learn all the time from the responses of their children, but that's not the same thing. The relationship, like the relationship between right and left hemispheres, is not necessarily an equal one. And at that stage in life, it's very important that children actually do pay attention, learn self-discipline, learn how to ingest information, which at the time they may find fascinating, but they may not see now why this is going to liberate them later to be truly creative. You can only be the creative person when you have had a period of strict discipline. And I suspect that this is true of Oriental meditative arts, spiritual practices, including the martial practices that you're talking about, that there needs to be a period of great self-denial, of great intensity of labour, and then one is free to allow things to... One becomes that pathway through which I love this expression of Rumi, that we are the flute through which the breath of Christ is passed, which is a really interesting idea.
It's fantastic, and that brings us back to containers, because there's two senses in which learning, for me, is a sacred container. One, I was unlucky enough to be born in the culture I was in as it fell apart, and do not feel necessarily, I had some great teachers at school, but do not feel that my culture gave me a form. It was a good vessel for me to shape whatever amorphous liquid this is that we can refer to as Caroline today. But I was lucky enough to walk into a garden in South London and find Mark's Tai Chi class after I'd broken my back, and through not taking care of my body, my disc herniated and I was becoming paralysed. So on my wedding day, I was becoming paralysed and ended up in Atkinson Morley having my disc removed. But anyway, that was a long story that I didn't need to tell. So I tried to find a Tai Chi class because I hadn't done it for about 15 years. And I walked into this South London garden and there was Mark teaching, and I already knew I was in the right place. I mean, talk about Temenos, it was a walled garden, and there were all these people of different races, heights, sexes, everybody just quietly getting on. So all these adults touching each other in an appropriate and mystifying way that I hadn't seen since I was a kid when I first did Tai Chi. And I already knew, I need to be here. I hope that what they're doing is good. So then after a few hours, feeling that, this is a container fit for all things. And when you find your area of study, it doesn't have to just be one thing, because I feel the same about art, and I felt the same about music, and I really feel the same about relationship, philia, friendship and family. There are these handful in my life of containers which are fit for whatever I pour in them. Whatever comes, you can form it. And I feel that Tai Chi is one of those ones where all the things could be looked at. But I don't feel that that's necessarily happening for people. So I would hope that education brings you a vessel and a shaping. And if you're lucky enough to get that, which I think you did, and I think I did in Tai Chi, then great. But if everything is just amorphous and there's no discipline and nothing, you don't have anything to to sort of play against. I was a goth and I hated mainstream culture, but I needed mainstream culture to bounce off.
Of course. It's that point I make about resistance, how incredibly important it is and creative it is. Having no boundaries and no resistance is not a creative or happy state of affairs.
No, the strictures that I love I use just these few natural materials for my art, are similar to the fact that in art we're only allowed to be upright almost all the time. And if I'm leaning and shoving and pushing, then it's not, even if I'm winning, it's wrong. And it's the principles have been lost. So yeah, I don't fight against having constraint. For me, that has been a joy. So I agree. Resistance is fertile, not futile.
So fertile, not futile, as you say.
But it's good after all these years to say something and to speak. Yeah.
It's been lovely. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you. Thank you, Iain.